Hello, I am Francis Shen, and it is a pleasure to be with you here today to present on psychology, neuroscience, and the enduring mysteries of mens rea. I'll give a short presentation, but first I just want to say thank you to Professor Sirota for putting on this wonderful program, to Arizona State for hosting it. This is such a moment of challenge for the criminal justice system, and although it doesn't get sometimes the headline attention it deserves, mens rea reform is really part and parcel, part of the discussion we need to have. So I really think it's an important moment to bring up these issues. I'm glad, Professor Sirota, that you're doing it. I'm sorry we can't all be there in person together, but I'm glad you're continuing this work, and I hope this contributes a little bit to the program. My marching orders are to give a sort of short, high-level overview and some thoughts on the relationship between emerging knowledge in fields such as psychology and neuroscience and our doctrine and understanding and potential reform of our doctrine and understanding about mens rea. And keeping things short, here's my game plan. I will give a little brief introduction about why and how I study mens rea. Then I'll provide a simple, really oversimplified framework, but I think a useful one for thinking about how these new knowledge bases might help us with our mens rea determinations and mens rea reform. And then we just have time for a couple of research snapshots pulled from some different studies that I think are interesting and illustrative of the key questions being asked and explored on the science side and some of the implications that these new studies may have for our work here on the legal side. So from my quarantine to yours, let's get after it. Who am I? Well, many things, but the most important thing for you to know is that I love mens rea. I really do. How do can I prove it to you? With this picture. I even have the t-shirt. And this is thanks to colleague Judge Morris Hoffman and his wife, who created these t-shirts for us after the publication of one of our earliest studies. And I'll talk a little bit about that study later. But I really do love the topic. I think it's very important. I really love the colleagues also that I've had a chance to work with, and let me thank them. So many of them, too many to mention by name, but you can read the slide. And I do want to give a shout out to the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Law and Neuroscience. The Intent and Punishment Working Group has produced so much of this work, both within the foundation's network's support and then beyond that. If you want to know more, you can check out the research network at lawneuro.org, and you'll learn more about these exciting studies and others. I split my time between Massachusetts General Hospital, the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, and University of Minnesota, and my lab works in these institutions, our neurolaw lab. Our motto in the lab is every story is a brain story. I think that's true, but the caveat or the next thing to say is that, as so many of you know, right now, so many of these stories are poorly understood or hardly understood at all. And in some ways, that's the mens rea story. But there are some things that we do know, and it's really important to lay those out on the line first. Here's what we know, that although we can't see it like this is a beautiful image. These researchers, you see the citation there, I commend you to look at their tremendous work. The beating brain. We can't feel, it doesn't feel like my brain is beating, it doesn't feel like my brain's doing anything at all, and yet it is, right? This is the beauty, the mystery of this organ. And somewhere in all that circuitry and all that activity are our intentions, are our mens rea, is the reckless mental state, is the negligent mental state. It's there, it's somewhere, it's hidden, but we know it's in this organ. We know that it is not mystical, it's not whimsical, it's not some homunculus. It is physically instantiated in our neurobiology, even if we don't know exactly how. That's a really bedrock principle. But the caveat, the second thing to say, is that we don't have yet direct access to that circuitry, to that mens rea circuitry. We're learning more and more about it, but we don't have direct access. And that really offers the challenge for the day. And I think the framework that I'm going to lay out tries to get at that, which is, how do we take improving, ever improving, awesome knowledge, but still incomplete knowledge, and apply it today to criminal justice reform, to mens rea reform? What can we do and what can't we do with this new knowledge is really a challenge that the interdisciplinary work of law and neuroscience, law and psychology faces. And let's dive in. So here's the framework, again, with the caveat that it's a simple one, oversimplified, but I think useful for framing this presentation. The mystery that we want to solve, that we want to address, is the age-old one. What was the defendant thinking? And I translate that a little bit roughly into saying, how was the defendant's brain processing information at the time of the alleged offense? How do we answer these questions? How do we get at this mystery? Well, we've got many tools. Some we've had forever and ever, and some we've had only in the advent of modern social science and modern natural science. So let's lay those out. What have we always been able to do? Well, we've always been able to ask the defendant. He or she might not always answer, but we're able to say, what were you thinking? This is the defendant's testimony. This is what the defendant tells the police during the investigation. We can also look at whatever the evidence gathered tells us about Dee's behavior at the time. And often those two things together, especially if they're congruent, will tell us everything we need to know. But sometimes, and maybe often, they don't tell us what we need to know. And so we go to other modes of analysis, other types of evidence. A lot of it we can generate ourselves, and we've had this next type of evidence forever and ever too. Those are just our intuitions. But we often use intuitions about how other people like the defendant like this act, and then sort of apply that to this particular defendant. If you're a part of that group, yeah, you probably were intending to do it, or you probably weren't. These intuitions can be biased or unbiased. They can be accurate or inaccurate, but we use them. We have new access to group data that comes from science. And science can tell us if we understand what sort of groups D is in. Is D in a group of individuals who've been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder? Is D in a group of those who are age 14 to 18? Is D in a group of those aged 85 plus? We might know something about generally how those groups make decisions, how they act and behave, and we can apply that general knowledge, though it's not easy to do, and you'll see the work of colleague David Fageman and others, but make a group to individual inference using that scientific data. We can also do these things individually, and so you have individual intuitions. Maybe we learned something in the trial, or we know something about the defendant. We don't know what he or she was doing on Tuesday at 5:52 p.m., but we know generally what this person was like. We've seen a picture painted, and that helps us make a guess about what was happening at 5:52 p.m. on a Tuesday. Same thing can be said for scientific data at the individual level. We might learn, for instance, that the defendant had a series of traumatic stressors in his or her life. We might learn that they've been diagnosed with a particular mental illness, mental disorder. We might learn that they have a traumatic brain injury, and so on and so forth. And perhaps that individual data might give us purchase and allow us to make a better guess, again, what they were doing at a particular moment in time, the alleged offense. So we put all of this together and we make our best guess. And as I've mentioned, some of these tools and types of evidence we've had forever and ever, but some are new, and that's what I want to focus on. These new science, both at the individual level, what might we learn about an individual's defendant, and what might we learn about the groups, the group or groups that the defendant is in, and how might that affect the way that we make our guess? How can we improve our guess? It's still a guess, but we can make perhaps an improved guess, a guess that would bring out a more just and more effective outcome. To start, I think my colleagues, law professor Stephen Morse and Judge Morse Hoffman, have really laid out very clearly what the general relationship is between any brain or mental abnormality or psychological abnormality and the negation of a particular mens rea. It actually is pretty straightforward. You look to see if this disordered or different mental state or different brain state somehow negates one of the requisite mens rea ingredients. It's like a recipe. Do you have the ingredient? And whether or not you have the ingredient may be in part dependent on what we know about the defendant's general mental state or diagnosis and so forth. Of course, there's a problem here, which is that we're never going to know for sure. And the lurking problem, as Morse and Hoffman point out, is that it is very difficult to determine a defendant's mental state at the time of the crime. Neuroscience doesn't come in and solve that lurking problem with a magic wand. But again, it may, in certain instances, improve the guesses we make. For instance, if we know that someone has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, perhaps that might help us make a guess about whether the defendant is telling the truth when he said he really didn't appreciate the risk involved in the alleged bad act he did. That's just one example. Let me give you one other concrete example, because it's an area that's drawing a lot of attention, and for good reason. We all know that a large percentage of crime comes from certain ages. There's an age crime curve, and this age group of adolescent and then young adult accounts for an outsized proportion of crime. There's been a lot of research over the last few decades, both in behavioral science and now in neuroscience, about these groups, the young adult group and adolescents. Just picking one piece of this research from Dr. Leah Somerville, a Harvard neuroscientist, a member of our affiliated faculty at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, she's pointed out that when you ask questions about brain maturity, you have to recognize that different circuitry develops differentially with age. Everything doesn't come online at the same time. Why is this relevant for mens rea considerations? It's relevant because some of the circuitry that's delayed and coming fully online is the very same circuitry, for instance, around risk perception and risk assessment and delayed discounting and so forth, the very same circuitry that's going to affect the formation of the mental state at the time of the alleged offense. And so this raises the question about whether or not group data about adolescent decision making, in both behavioral data and neurodata, should perhaps change the way that we look at assessment of mens rea in adolescents and in young adults. Some law professors have argued, yes, we should. To take one example, law professor Jenny Carroll says that the one-size-fit-all approach to mens rea, that is, we're going to assess mens rea the same way we do in a 15-year-old as we do in a 35-year-old, this might not hold a lot of water. Perhaps our presumptions should be different. Doesn't mean that a 15-year-old can't intend to seriously harm someone, of course not. But it means, again, that in calibrating the way we make our guesses, we might want to be informed by this potentially relevant science. I leave you to think about that. And as I do, let me transition to one other question. Different from this one, the next slide that I'm going to show you is science that asks not about a particular defendant, but about the system as a whole. Here's the study. It was conducted by Dr. Iris Villeras, who's now at the University of Minnesota in the psychology department, along with colleagues Reed Montague and Gideon Yaffe and Owen Jones and many others. And here what they wanted to do was proof of concept, to say, you know, the law drew these buckets of mental states. Even the model penal code in the mid-20th century drew this purpose and knowing and reckless. Are those really biological states, neurobiological states? And could we find out? This is a really interesting study. I don't have time to go into the details. It's this exquisite experiment that took years to design and to execute. The bottom line is that some of their subjects in the fMRI scanner were in what could be described as a knowing mental state. Now, how they got them in the knowing mental state, you got to read the paper. I commend you to do it. And others were in the reckless mental state. And the research group was able to distinguish with statistical significance between, based on the brain imaging, between the reckless and the knowing groups. Proof of concept that perhaps, and lots more work has to be done with all the caveats we should add right now, but an intriguing and important finding to suggest that, yes, maybe those categories are the right categories, or at least headed in the right direction, that there are in fact these distinct mental states, that cutting at some of these joints makes sense for the law to do. And perhaps, as I said before, we might do it better, might calibrate our guesses better, harnessing some of the other research that's coming online. So a lot of more could be said there, but in the interest of time, let me move on and snapshot another set of research. So the stuff that we just looked at examined these things up here. That is the stuff that looked at how mental states are actually formed in an individual. But there's also a really neat, I think it's neat, but I'm involved in it, so you'll have to decide if you think it's neat too, body of research that says, what about those intuitions that the punishers, that the assessors have? Those jurors who are sitting there, or potentially judges, and listening to all this evidence, and then making an assessment about a person they've never met at a time that they weren't at, and saying, I'm going to make a guess. I'm going to do mind reading of this defendant and figure out whether he was acting purposefully or knowingly or recklessly. How are individuals making those blame assessments and punishment decisions? This body of research as emerging, and there's a neuroscience component to it. At least one theory, and it's just a theory because these are new and it's an emerging area, comes from neuroscientists Frank Kruger and Judge Morris Hoffman, and they suggest that maybe we could think about three different networks. Sort of this is getting into the Punisher's brain. There's a salience network. So the third party, the jurors got to first figure out based on what they think, is there even a bad thing that's happened here? Sort of, well, and how do you determine whether there's a harm? Then there's a network that has to think about, well, is someone to blame for this? And this is, I'll mention some additional data on this from other studies, the moment at which a default mode network perhaps kicks in to integrate information, both about the harm to the victim and about, now we're into mens rea, the mental state of the alleged perpetrator. Now, if there's some blame to be doled out, how much punishment? Well, then there's yet another network, perhaps as suggested as a central executive network, to consider all these other contextual details and figure out a punishment. Right? So there are these different networks. And is this exactly the right picture? Who knows? That's what science it is, right? We don't know. This is the latest, greatest hypothesis, but it's only a hypothesis. It's a theory. There's growing evidence for it, but also for competing theories. We'll figure it out in the coming years. Let's deep dive into that moment where the mental state and the harm level is integrated. This was a study that I had the pleasure to do with colleagues. Lead author is Matthew Ginther, a very talented JD, PhD neuroscientist and attorney, who through countless hours of work in the scanner and with other colleagues, Renee Maurois' lab at Vanderbilt, evaluated these differential moments of assessing harm, assessing mental state of the individual who perpetrated the harm, integrating those to arrive at a punishment decision. And again, I commend you to read the study. I'll simply say that I think for purposes of a mens rea reform discussion, it's worthwhile to know that mens rea is integrated. It's central to these blame and calculus determinations, but it's never alone. It's always integrated, right, with the harm, with these other contextual factors. And there's a lot of psychology, which I'll mention in a moment, that is starting to unravel some of the ways in which our intuitions and the way that we integrate this information is perhaps counterintuitive and perhaps gets in the way of justice. And we'll think about that. So just one more point on the neuroscience, which is to say that the way our brains assess a mental state, for instance, was it intentional action or unintentional action, then subsequently affects our emotional circuitry and our response. We don't know exactly the sequencing here and the extent to which one happens before another, but we know they're really interrelated. This was a neat study, again, coming out of that same Maurois lab with Ginther and other colleagues, Michael Treadway as lead author, and they found that graphic descriptions of the harm really, it's like, boy, that's going to amp up the amygdala activity and the amygdala's connection to other parts of lateral prefrontal cortex, but only if the defendant acted intentionally. If the subject there in the scanner thought that the person they were reading about did not act intentionally, that emotional circuitry was not activated. So a lot hinges on mens rea. But it's not just mens rea, it's mens rea in context. And this is a point that I think is really important. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that even if you hold mens rea constant across would-be, mock trial assessments, we're likely to blame differently based on character. I like this quote from Professor Janice Nadler. We are more likely to blame severely a drug-addicted high school dropout who knocks down 10 rural mailboxes with a baseball bat as opposed to the straight-A student who is on the chess team, who engages in the same act. The mens rea calculus is the same in both. Did they act intentionally? Yeah, they knew exactly what they were doing and it was their purpose to destroy the mailbox with their bat. That part of the information sort of processing is the same, but somewhere in that integration on consideration of other factors, both harm and context and character, the end result, the punishment, the blame is different. At this point, you should be asking, or at least thinking about, well, what about race and gender and other identities and social class? And yes, it would seem very likely that those things could work themselves in as well, right? Mens rea is contextual, it's challenging, but it's even more challenging because of this context. There's one effect that you should know about in this literature. It's called the Nobe effect, or Nobe effect, depending on how you pronounce it. It was developed by experimental philosopher and psychologist Jos Nobe at Yale. And it's best described by you actually seeing the original study. It's just a gorgeous study, simple and elegant all at the same time. Here it is. So he told subjects in the harm condition the following. The vice president of a company went to the chairman of the board and said, "We are thinking about starting a new program. It will help us increase profits, but it will also harm the environment." The chairman of the board answered, "I don't care at all about harming the environment. I just want to make as much profit as I can. Let's start the new program." They started the new program, and sure enough, the environment was harmed. Let's go to the help condition, right? The vice president of the company went to the chairman of the board and said, "We are thinking of starting a new program. It will help us increase profits." The chairman of the board answered, "I don't care at all about helping the environment. I just want to make as much profit as I can. Let's start the new program." They started the new program. Sure enough, the environment was helped. So you've got one case in which the side effect is helping the environment, the other case in which the side effect is harming the environment. It's very clear in both cases. It's abundantly clear that, as he says, "I don't care," said the chairman. "I just want to make as much profit as I can." What is his intention? To make profit. It is abundantly clear. And yet, in the harm condition, 82% of subjects say that the chairman brought about the bad side effect intentionally. In the help condition, 77% of subjects say that the chairman did not bring about the good side effect intentionally. Just let that sit in for a second. This finding has been replicated in study after study, in context after context, including in judges. This was a study that came out relatively recently, and bottom line is they found that this effect holds in judges. Professionals are sensitive to the moral valence of the outcome. These are sitting judges, and that the worse the outcome, the higher the propensity to prescribe intentionality. Right? These biases, if you want to call them that, are simply these predispositions to see intentionality in some and not in others, are real. They've been replicated, and there are a whole bunch of other heuristics that show up in the punisher's brain when we assess mens rea and when we take mens rea and then translate it into brain. If you want to read more, check out The Punisher's Brain, a fantastic book by my colleague, Morris Hoffman. Let me close by talking about some studies that we've run. This is again with a number of colleagues, and you see the studies here on the slide. I'm just going to mention the first one and a couple of twists on the last ones in the interest of time. We wanted to look at whether or not these mental states, which will be, for those of you familiar with the Model Penal Code, old hat, you probably have them memorized, but for those who are new, the Model Penal Code, authors of the Model Penal Code took all the possible mental states of the world and said, we're going to divide them up into a clean system. There are going to be purpose, there's going to be knowing, reckless, and negligent. And we wanted to ask a question, well, can jurors actually sort amongst these things? And we eventually took that into the scanner. For those who are not familiar with the MPC, I teach it this way I did it this past spring in COVID, right? And again, in the interest of time, I won't go through it, but if you want to read the slide, you can. The basic idea is that there is desire-based purpose. It is John's intention to harm someone with COVID by coughing. There could be knowledge that you have COVID and you know you might infect someone, but you're going to do this anyway because you just need you need something else, right? Your intention is to do something else, but you know you're going to cause the harm. Reckless is you don't know it's going to happen. It's not practically certain, but there's a reasonable likelihood. And then negligent, right? You should have known, but you didn't. So we asked this question, how do they rank order these categories by punishment? Is this the right order, PKRN? And can they actually sort between them? The study went like this, in brief. We created 150 different scenarios. We varied by harm. We had 10 fact patterns that were themes that were in low harm, 10 in medium, 10 in high. And within each of those, we varied the 5 mental states so that we had P, K, R, and mental states. In subsequent work, I even changed the name and the age. I probably don't have time to talk about that, but we've done a lot of work here. How did we signal the mental state? Well, we kept the first and the third sentence the same of every scenario, and we changed the signal in the second mental state. You can read the study for the details. I'll jump through, I think, simply to this illustration. So you start with a statement. Every year, Emily holds a 4th of July party at her home where she invites family and friends to enjoy the food. Then at the end, this firework Emily sets off explodes next to Ryan had. It burst his eardrum. So there's the harm. Every scenario is the same at the beginning and the end. What's different is the stuff in the middle. Did she do this intentionally? Did she do it recklessly? And so forth. Let me go to the bottom line, that when subjects read these studies and they ask for, we were asking the punishment on a scale of 1 to 9, we see a really clear breakout between P and blameless in accordance with the model penal code's assumptions. Purposeful action punished the worst, negligent in the middle, blameless the least. But what about P, K, and R? Well, this was the finding that really struck us, and one that we've subsequently interrogated in different ways. There seems to be no difference, and statistically there was no difference between the punishment ratings for K and R. Now, K and R did generally show up between P and N, that is, they're placed right, but the distinction didn't matter. And it turned out that this was because subjects couldn't tell the difference between K and R. When you ask them to sort, their sorting accuracy is above chance. Chance would be 25% here, 1 out of 5, but not that great and not nearly as good as purposeful or blameless action. Now, does it matter that subjects can't tell the difference between knowing and reckless? Yeah, it does in some instances. Not always, but it can. Here's an example. Often no, but in Colorado, for instance, a reckless killing will get you probation potentially to 6 years. A knowing killing, 16 to 48 years. We are talking a difference of someone walking out on probation versus almost 5 decades in incarceration because of a distinction between a knowing and a reckless mental state. A distinction that it seems jurors cannot reliably make. Come back to this another context where it matters all the time. So we did in new experiments, we said, well, wait a second, maybe we could just modify the definitions, right, and improve the sorting accuracy. Maybe it was just in our own study, like we just needed to improve the signaling language, and maybe we could just use different words. So we tried that, and we had some minor improvements, but still, even with our newer accuracy, knowing and reckless, a little bit better, so we could see some improvement. And by the way, you're talking about mens rea reform, very concrete thing to consider is what words are you using in your jury instructions and in the statute? And can those be improved? And can you communicate more clearly to the jury what is meant by knowing and what is meant by reckless? I think the answer is absolutely. We have some suggestions in this work. Even when you try and modify further, you can, yes, improve, again, through language, and there's called the language of mens rea, this study, what you get through new R signals, but it still begs the question about whether or not these categories can be distinguished by lay jurors. So I asked before, does K and R distinction matter? In result-oriented crimes, again, often not, but all the time in circumstance element crimes. And we had a whole bunch of examples in the study that we ran looking at these circumstance element crimes. Again, credit to our great group, Ken Simons and Matt Ginther and Morris Hoffman and Richard Bonney and Owen Jones. And we spent a lot of time on this. It matters if John actually knew, or whoever the defendant is, knew that the drugs were in the trunk, as opposed to just had maybe a suspicion that they were there. It matters if he actually knows the goods were stolen. It matters if he actually knows that the individual was underage. And in these contexts, again, the same pattern holds. jurors or would-be jurors simply can't really make this distinction. Moreover, it seems that in their punishment, I'll leave you with this thought, they're ready to punish at recklessness, even though the law demands that you wait until knowledge to inflict some of these guilt decisions and punishment. In short, and going back to this slide, we have new science in a whole bunch of areas. New science that is shaping our understanding of the way that our intuitions work, the way that we integrate informations in our brain, and how that integration produces an outcome, a guilt assessment, a mens rea assessment, a blame and punishment assessment. And we're learning, as those studies and others that I didn't have time to mention, that there are a lot of potentially problematic ways in which we are and have been making those decisions. It's certainly reason for, I think, re-examination. Now, our studies don't go far enough to know exactly what the answer is and what the revision should look like, but I think they and other studies suggest that careful consideration is in order. In addition, we have those studies that I mentioned at the outset that are increasingly showing us that both in particular individuals, if you've got individualized neuropsych assessment or clinical assessment, and for groups of individuals in which the defendant might be one, we're learning about the way that they process information. And some of that information processing is related to the types of information processing that we are examining, even if we don't use those words, when we assess mens rea. Those two, I think, paved the way for careful consideration and reconsideration of our existing mens rea doctrine. In closing, I'll say this, and it's the one of the taglines, the mottos, the motivations of our work at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. All of this new scientific knowledge, and it's not dispositive, it's not a magic wand, it's not going to suddenly, this is why it's in the enduring mysteriousness, the enduring mystery of mens rea, it's not going to solve that mystery, but it can help us. It can help us. We can do better, and the idea is that better decisions aligned with science can produce better outcomes aligned with justice. And I think we can say this about mens rea. Better decisions and better doctrine and better approaches to mens rea determinations can produce better outcomes aligned with justice. So I hope this has given you something to think about, maybe to disagree about, and I look forward in any venue where we might do it to discussing further. Thanks for listening. Have a great conference. And with that, we'll say goodbye.